Understanding boundaries is often confusing to many, sometimes even uncomfortable to talk about. Nevertheless, the understanding of boundaries is important to communicate clarity in what you want your interaction with other people to be like. The focus of establishing boundaries is usually concentrated towards romantic or intimate relationships, and while establishing and respecting boundaries in such relationships is very important, it's not the only aspect of life that benefits from having healthy boundaries. We need to proclaim our boundaries in our day-to-day interactions as well, including in our relationships with our families, friends, co-workers, and even strangers. Now, before we head on to making our boundaries known to everyone else, we need to first understand what boundaries mean to us on a personal level. Personal boundaries are essentially the physical, emotional, and mental limits and rules that regulate your interactions with someone. It offers a guideline to the other person so they can modify their behavior to fit your level of comfort. Boundaries can range from being collapsed to being rigid. Healthy boundaries fall somewhere in the middle of this spectrum. A person with collapsed boundaries might possess a fear of rejection or abandonment, leading them to have loose or indefinite boundaries. They might often find themselves excessively compromising their own boundaries to accommodate the other person's needs. On the polar extreme are people with rigid boundaries. Rigid boundaries could look like the absolute unwillingness to engage in perspective taking and modifying one's own behavior to accommodate another's needs. A person with healthy boundaries would be in tune and aware of their wants, needs, and preferences. They choose to share information about themselves in a conscious way that doesn't cause distress to themselves or others due to oversharing or undersharing. Setting healthy boundaries means to preserve your own principles and prioritize your own well-being. The kind of boundaries people set during their interactions changes from person to person with different cultures and according to the setting. One might even have a combination of rigid, collapsed, and healthy boundaries depending on the situation. Boundaries are static. They can change with time and experiences. The first step in establishing your boundaries is introspection and reflection on what your wants and needs are. You can ask yourself questions like, what are my expectations and limits? What challenges do I face in maintaining boundaries? What is my approach to inner and external conflicts? Are my current boundaries healthy? How can I work on having more healthy boundaries? Once you're aware of what you are comfortable with, the next step is to clearly and directly state your boundary to the other person. Consider if your wants are fair and reasonable. When you're communicating your boundaries, be assertive in your verbal and body language. Listen to the other person's perspective and reevaluate your stance when appropriate. Allow room for compromise and accommodation, but not at the expense of yours or the other person's well-being. Lastly, be prepared to reassert your wants in case you're met with resistance. Assess how emotionally and physically safe you feel in that environment. Setting consequences for when someone oversteps your boundaries and explicitly stating those consequences to the person is a useful way to emphasize the importance of your boundaries. Boundaries enable us to take accountability for our own actions. It helps us to have a healthy balance between giving and taking time and energy. It facilitates intimacy in our relationships while maintaining our individuality. And most importantly, we become aware of ourselves and our feelings. By setting boundaries, we are prioritizing our physical and mental well-being and accepting our needs without any guilt or shame.